Hey, Professor Carafit in the bio bunker here. We're going to finish community ecology and talk a bit about energy cycling today. So we're finishing this chapter and moving into a little bit of content from 55 as well. Before I do, I wanted to show you a figure from the previous chapter when we talked a little bit about character displacement. I wanted to show you these two species. Notice that when these two species are on different islands, notice this is how deep their beaks are. Notice that population 1, this is 1 and this is 2. Notice that they have overlapping sizes of beaks, right? Because they're eating similar foods on these different islands. But when they get put on the same island, they're sympatric. Notice that this species here ends up shifting to a smaller beak on average, and this one shifts to a larger beak, and they don't overlap. And that's what happens when these two organisms are competing for similar food resources. If they kept competing for the same resource, one species would die and one would live. But instead, they shift, and one goes for one kind of food and one goes for another, and that pushes their evolution. They adapt to new food sources and things. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about that character displacement. Okay, so we're in community ecology here. We're talking about trophic structure. And I want to point out that trophic, this is a word you may not, well, you know this word, troph, like autotroph, self-feeding. It means feeding, right? Um, Trophic structure is the feeding relationships between different organisms in the community. And it's when we're trying to figure out how a community is put together, we figure out these trophic layers, these trophic structures. And basically we figure out the food chains in these different communities. So food chains are how different trophic levels from producers to top carnivores link together. And each level of that chain is known as a trophic level. So if you hear those words, that's what we're talking about. Okay, so here's an example of a terrestrial and a marine food chain. So starting at the bottom, we have the primary producers. Primary producers are those that gather sunlight energy and make carbohydrates. Okay? So that would be phytoplankton or plants, depending on which habitat we're in. And then primary producers, are eaten by primary consumers. So primary consumers eat primary producers. Then primary consumers are eaten by secondary consumers. So in the case of grasshoppers eating a flower, grasshoppers are eaten by mice or voles, right? Whereas zooplankton eats phytoplankton, and zooplankton is eaten by carnivores, like those fish. And then tertiary consumers eat secondary consumers, and then quaternary consumers eat tertiary consumers. And so we have this layers of these trophic levels where one thing feeds on one thing, which feeds on another, which feeds on another. And of course, there are examples where a tertiary consumer might sometimes eat a primary consumer. You know, all of these are models of how we model how the environment works and how it helps us to understand what's going on. But they're important nonetheless. So be familiar with that hierarchy on who feeds on whom, and know that a primary producer is the one that captures sunlight energy and makes carbohydrates. They're eaten by primary consumers, and so on and so forth. Now, when we take several food chains and link them together, we get what is known as a food web. And we can see that in reality, you know, it's always a little messier than a food chain, where these things interact in different ways, okay? So food webs are combinations of food chains, but it's easier to study the chains and then figure out how it all fits together later than to try to start by learning how the food web works. Okay, so we have all these organisms feeding on one another, and so we're transferring energy from the sun to plants, and then from plants to primary consumers, and so on and so forth. And remember, if you go back to this chapter on cellular respiration, every time you transfer energy, you lose some as heat, right? So birds and mammals have, in terms of how well they're able to grab a hold of food and then utilize it to build their bodies and then run cellular respiration and store that and store what's left over. they have efficiencies of around 1 to 3%, meaning they burn a lot of calories in endothermy to stay warm. And so they don't save a lot of that food. That food doesn't go into building parts of their bodies. Just a little bit of it does. Fish have higher production efficiencies. By production, I mean the ability to eat food and then store some of it permanently rather than just burn it immediately. Okay? Fish have higher production efficiencies because they're ectotherms. Now, insects and microorganisms, they tend to be really good at this. They have efficiencies of like 40% or more. They can really store a lot of energy. But what's important to note is that with each change in trophic level, so from producer to consumer and so on, we have an exchange of energy of only about 10%. Only about 10% of the food that a primary producer eats gets passed on to a secondary consumer. Okay, so you have a loss of 90% of that energy every time you move up to levels of that trophic hierarchy. So what happens, remember, energy flows through ecosystems. So energy comes in as light, hits the plant, photosystem 2 and photosystem 1 kick on, the Calvin cycle kicks on, we build carbohydrates, that energy is locked in as carbohydrate. A primary consumer eats it. A bunch of that is lost as heat. Some of it's stored in that primary consumer. Then a secondary consumer eats that primary consumer. And about 10% of that plant's energy passes on to that primary consumer. And then only about 10% of that to that secondary consumer. And only about 10% of that secondary's consumer energy passes on to the tertiary consumer. So that means that you have way fewer top predators than you have prey because the energy transfer is very inefficient. So remember, light enters an ecosystem as, energy enters the ecosystem as light and it is lost as heat as we transfer food up that hierarchy. Here we can see 100,000 joules of sunlight smacking the earth. Now, very little of that is actually captured by plants, less than 10%. But plants, in this case, primary producers capture 10,000 joules of energy. Joules is a unit of energy. Only 10% of that gets passed on to the primary consumer. 1,000 joules goes to the primary consumer and is stored there. Only 10% of that gets passed on to the secondary consumer, so only 1,000 joules. And by the time the tertiary consumer comes along, how much is left out of that 10,000 joules captured by the plants? Only 10. 10 joules of energy are left for that tertiary consumer. So as energy is transferred up, every time it's transferred, a bunch of it is lost as heat or waste matter, and it's not a 100% efficient transfer. So that, once again, is why you have way fewer top predators than you have plants. Now, energy flows through an ecosystem, flows in, flows out. But nutrients cycle through an ecosystem. They're passed on forever, essentially, until life is extinct. And so here's just a generic nutrient cycle to show you this. So let's have a quick look at what's going on in this diagram. So let's start with this one up here, okay? All right, so reservoir A, organic material. We're just following organic material, okay? So living organisms are made of organic material, right? Eventually they die, and some of their organic material turns into dirt. Some of it may turn into coal or whatever. Some of it may be burned by humans in the case of coal and oil, releasing CO2 back into the air, whatever. Some of it's locked in as solid material, like we see in rocks. If that dirt turns to rock over time, right? That rock can be eroded and release that organic material back into the environment. Let's look at a more concrete example that's easier to talk about. Focus on carbon. So carbon is available in the atmosphere. As you know, it's taken up by plants in photosynthesis. We can see that over here in the diagram. Photosynthesis kicks on, pulls carbon out of the atmosphere, turns it into sugar. Well, primary consumers eat those primary producers, and that carbon gets transferred to a rabbit. That rabbit's energy gets transferred to the bobcat that we see here. That bobcat and the rabbit and the trees eventually die and decompose, and some of that carbon ends up in the dirt. Some of it returns to the atmosphere. Remember, some of this carbon goes back whenever they breathe. They exhale. It comes into the atmosphere. Oh, I have a phone call. Give me just a second. All right, so organisms exhale CO2 back into the air. So that CO2 that they're exhaling used to be the carbohydrates in the plants, right? When the organisms die, they decompose. That releases CO2 into the atmosphere. Or they may be locked into the ground. That's when carbon is solidified and buried in the dirt or turned to rock, we call that a carbon sink. Carbon is locked up as solid material then. Same thing's happening in the oceans. Phytoplankton pull CO2 out of the air. Fish release CO2 back into the air. When we burn fossil fuels, so critters that used to be alive, what is coal? Coal is nothing but carbon that used to be in the atmosphere that ancient plants turned into sugar, and then it fossilized into coal. So we burn that and we put extra CO2 into the atmosphere. So that is what a cycle is. CO2 released into the air can be pulled back up by plants and turned into solid material again. And organisms eat it and it passes through and it goes back to the atmosphere again. The problem that we humans are having is we're pumping ancient carbon back into the atmosphere way more than is currently in the atmosphere, and we're changing the climate because of that. And we'll talk more about that in a future lecture on human impacts in the environment. So study a few of these cycles, but pay the most attention to the carbon cycle. If I ask you anything about cycles on the final, it'll focus on the carbon cycle.